Now, after the Muslims invaded Iran, Persia, it was called Persia at the time, essentially, and it was approximately in 651 or so. It wasn't too long. It was maybe about a generation after Muhammad died. When they invaded Persia, at first the Zoroastrians were treated like Thimmi, which means they were treated as people of the book, which in Islam are members of religions that are considered to be revealed by God. And it's clear from internal evidence that Muslims knew about Zoroastrians. They were aware of them and probably had been influenced by them. And what being Thimmi meant was that Thimmi are people like Jews and Christians, and then later in India would sometimes become Buddhists, would sometimes be considered Thimmi. These were groups that had a special protected status in Islamic society. They were second-class citizens in a way. They paid a tax for this protection, but they were also permitted, at least according to Islamic law, they were permitted to worship in the manner that they chose. They weren't forced to convert, basically. And even though this doesn't sound great now, for the time period, this was actually very liberal. If you look, for example, in Europe, when Christianity would conquer an area, under Charlemagne, for example, if the population didn't convert, they could be enslaved or killed or exiled. So being able to stay home, and even though you were sort of at a second-class situation, but permitted to still maintain your own culture and religious beliefs, was considered to be, quite tolerant at the time. Now, and of course, how this was enforced varied a lot, so depending on who the ruler was, this could be a good thing or a bad thing. Now, over time, as the centuries went by, more and more people began to convert to Islam in various ways because it was just easier. They were the ruling class, and if you wanted to actually get ahead in the world, you did need to convert. And then, beginning in about the 8th or 9th century, various Mongol and Turkic peoples began to invade from the north, from Central Asia, and a lot of these people converted to Islam because Islam was the dominant religion, and if you wanted, to sort of get in with the society, that's what you converted to. So Zoroastrians came under increasing pressure, and by the 10th century, a lot of them had begun to immigrate to India. India is where the largest population of Zoroastrians are today. And this was the situation basically throughout a number of different types of invasions, including the large Mongol invasions of the 13th century into the 14th century. And then in the beginning of the 16th century, in 1501, a leader named Shah Ismail I united, as I say here, a coalition of ethnic Iranian tribes against various of the Mongol Turkic rulers. And he had a vision that basically if he could unify all of Iran, all the Iranian peoples, under a Shia auspices, a Shia Islamic auspice. Up to this point, most of the Muslims in Iran had been Sunni, although there was a significant Shia minority. But he had this idea that if you could unify all of Iran under a Shia auspices, then it would keep invaders out, essentially. And because you have to also look at what's going on in the wider world. By this time, by 1501, European powers are beginning to overspread the world, overspread the Americas, obviously, and the Middle East, and they're interested in going to India. And so there was the issue of possible colonialism at that time. And so the Shah Ismail I believed that unifying the nation in this way would keep invaders out. And to some degree, he was correct about that. But he was not tolerant of religious minorities. And so this triggered another wave of immigration of Zoroastrians to India. It has been reported that in the wake of the most recent conflicts, the Syrian conflict specifically, and some of the really horrific things that came out of that in the Middle East, that there are some members of the Kurdish community. The Kurds are one ethnic group that have been present in Iran and in surrounding environs for thousands of years, and are considered to be an Iranian ethnicity, Iranian in the sense of a national ethnicity. And there has been a resurgence, according to rumor, there has been recently a resurgence in conversion to Zoroastrianism due to profound disillusionment with both Sunni and Shia Islam. We don't know how much of that is a rumor and how much of that is true. But currently the largest populations of Zoroastrians are in India, as I've said, where they're called Parsis. And most of them are located around in the Delhi area in the state of Gujarat. And then Iran they still have a population of Zoroastrians. They are one of the few legally permitted religions other than Shia Muslims. Then the United States has a population, Canada, the UK, and Australia. And the total Zoroastrian population in the world is no more than about 150,000. And here's a couple of interesting pictures. The map here shows the location of a very, very ancient civilization that actually does appear in the Bible, the kingdom of Elam. We don't know that much about the kingdom of Elam because much of its culture was overlaid with subsequent Persian culture. But it's thought, at least by some scholars, that Elam actually played a fairly significant role in how some of the ideas about Zoroastrianism over time were developed, and may be the source, for example, of that Faravahar that I showed you at the very beginning. We don't know exactly what the origin of the Elamites were. They spoke what is called a language isolate, which means that it's not related to any of the languages around it. And some of the deities that they worship are significantly different than those of the Sumerians. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. They did engage in building ziggurats and some of the other architectural things that you find in Mesopotamia. But there were also significant differences in that, for example, women held a much higher status in their culture. And there have been some scholars that have suggested and have seen connections between the Elamites and their culture and possible connections to the Dravidian cultures and languages in southern India. Certainly we know that there was extensive trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus River valleys in what is now western India and certainly into southern India. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility. We just don't know. What we know is that their ancient city of Susa, which you see right here, and I'm pointing out with the mouse, that city remained an important city even through the subsequent Persian empires. So the Elamite influence was certainly there. The ruins that you see here are what's part of what is left of the palace of Persepolis. Persepolis was the Greek name for this particular city when Alexander the Great conquered the Achaemenid Empire. This was one of the cities that he conquered. It was actually one of his prizes, one of his goals. And this city complex, this palace in particular, was already renowned throughout the ancient world as an extraordinary place. This palace, for example, was built on top of a very elaborate water piping system that permitted the palace to be using water pressure and water to be warmed or cooled, in the winter or the summer. And it was a very complex and interesting building that was the wonder of its time. At some point it burned, and we don't know exactly when that happened or exactly what happened there to cause that. But, one of the persistent stories is that somehow Alexander the Great, accidentally or on purpose, caused the burning of this palace as a result of a drunken fit and an accident, which, again, we don't know whether that happened that way, but, if you know anything else about some of what Alexander the Great did in some of his other escapades, it is not out of the realm of possibility. And this is going into Iran proper, and we'll talk more about these fire temples in a little bit. But these are two photos of two different types of fire temples. In the ancient world, especially in the earliest days of Zoroastrianism, a lot of these fire temples were built in large open spaces or on the tops of mountains. And there are many places in Iran where ancient examples of these fire temples can still be found. And this is an example of one, the one on the left. There are many, many places where, in very isolated areas on the tops of mountains, you'll find these little structures where simple fire temples originally were built. And then on the right, you have in the traditional Zoroastrian city of Yazd, you have a new fire temple, new in the sense that it's been built and maintained by the current government as kind of a tourist attraction, so that it's maintained nicely, and it's not that it's not active. Worship services do occur there, but a lot of the stuff that's done there is done for the benefit of tourists. My understanding of Yazd is that when Zoroastrians want to really worship, there's a cavern, there's a cave in the old part of the city, and that's where they go and do their actual worship. This is where they go and do their show worship, so to speak, fire temples are still an important part of Zoroastrian practice and worship. And again, we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, to just introduce Zarathustra briefly before I go on to the next video. According to the story, he was of a priestly family, and as I say here, he'd become distressed that members of his clan were needlessly sacrificing animals to satisfy the magical lusts of local rulers for the sake of making a buck. I mean, it's the easiest, simplest way to put it. He went off into the wilderness and was seized by a spirit of the waters, Anahita, and through her, what are called the Amesha Spenta, or the immortal holies, revealed themselves. He began spreading the good word, and it is called this, the good word of the Amesha Spentas, and started a reform of the indigenous Iranian religion that he'd been raised with. And what we know of that indigenous religion is that it was not all that different from pre-Vedic Indian Aryan traditions that you find in like the Vedas in India. Now, obviously, there was pushback to this, and he tangled the rest of his life with local and regional authorities. But over time, his reform gained traction. And there are fragments of his original revelations, which come in the form of songs that are preserved in the Gathas. And in fact, I think if I remember right, the term Gatha means songs, like revealed songs. And linguists have done a lot of work with these Gathas, and they've concluded that they are probably the original work of a single person, and that the age and the dialect appears to be correct and cognate to, as I said, the language that's recorded in the Vedas in Sanskrit. So it is definitely Indo-European in origin, of the same language family. And in fact, a lot of the gods are very similar. Some of them have exactly the same names. So I will continue in the next video.